let's get to the conversation that we are having today, and that has to do with press freedom, freedom of expression, as enshrined and guaranteed in Section 22 of the Constitution that allows the press to hold government and the powerful to account at all times. That is what the Constitution says. But we've seen a couple of things going on. Recently, a gentleman was actually arrested. Ajuwon Soyinka was arrested, but he's been released. We've had issues with PDOM. They say he's a whistleblower or he's an investigative journalist. He was arrested for many days. Nobody could tell where it was, and some people raised alarm, and then eventually the police came out and said, this is with us, we've arrested him, and these are the charges these are the things we're going to sue him for, from cybercrime to a couple of other things that they listed. But the challenge has always been the fact that the style of arrest and this Gestapo style that some people have said that the authorities use is not acceptable in the democracy. So that is what we'll be talking about today on the program. The government has their reason, the media have their reason. We're being joined on the program by Mr. Lanre Arogundade is from International Press Center and the PRO of Association of Communication Scholars and Professionals. Thank you, sir, for coming on the program.
Thank you very much for having me this afternoon.
I think my first direct question will be in your assessment. So let's stay with under President Bola Tinubu, which is what we're looking at today. Is the press free under the Tinubu administration, in your view?
I would say the press is free to publish, but the press is not safe. In other words, we're actually not free, because on the surface, anybody would say, oh, but you are publishing what you like and all things like happening. But we're seeing consequences for journalists, doing, their work. And as a matter of fact, you cannot even say whether it's because of what journalists, publish that, they are being subjected to this kind of harassment. Nobody, for example, has said that Ajuwon Soyinka, publish anything, maybe which could be termed offensive or false or whatever. He traveled, came back, and then he was apprehended at the airport. Apparently, given my own personal experience, must be on a watch list. And then the next thing was he was detained for 6 hours, and then he was let go, but his passport, was seized. So what we see is deteriorating situation of press freedom under this administration, and it's becoming extremely, worrisome. Particularly if you look at some of the examples that we're seeing, examples that would seem as if they are laying, precedents that were not there before. We have the case of Abdul Rashid, for example, who worked as an investigative journalist for the cable, and did a story that exposed the fact that about 22 sachet water factories in Sokoto State were not licensed by the appropriate, body, that is NAFDAC. And then what has happened to him is being handed by the DSS and the police, asking him to come, to Sokoto. Ordinarily, you would think that this is a journalist that should be given an award by the government for helping the government, to do its work, because the responsibility of that agency is that you must register, because we are talking of livelihood. We are talking of what could be the implication if people continue to consume water that comes from such a factory, but it's being handed all about. That's one example. The other example, I like to start, has to do with that of, we don't really accept citizen journalists, but somebody who worked as an online in the eastern part of the country. He was picked up, he was taken to court, and the court said he should be remanded, and he was taken to prison for almost a period of 1 month. That leads me to another trend we are seeing, and that trend is the fact that, because you started by talking about the Constitution, democracy is governed by rule of law, and the Constitution is the expression or is the document that gives meaning to that rule of law. And what we all know is that if somebody is arrested for any offense at all, that person, if any security agency has reason to hold that person for more than 24 hours, you have to go to court to state your reason, and then it will be left, to the court. But we're having instances where journalists are even picked up and there is denial that, oh, we don't know, we are not responsible, until when people cry out, and then they will say, oh, yes, he's with us. And days, will have gone. So that is another trend that we see that gives us concern and makes us to think that the situation is actually, getting worrisome. But there's also another dimension which I think is quite dangerous. And that is the fact that, private people are using, the security agencies to harass the press. And, this is happening, under this administration. And when we talk about administration, it's to the extent that we believe that the government itself needs to sit up and intervene decisively. The example I gave of the journalist in Sokoto, apparently that factory is not owned by government. It's owned by a private individual who must have gone to report in to the police. And what the police or the DSS should have done was to say, look, is the story published against your factory true or false? If you believe it's false, at the level of laws, rule of law, then they could advise and say, well, there are media regulatory bodies that you can report the journalist to. You can even go to court to say you've been lied against. That is allowed under our law. But now, you go and then report to the police, and the police begins to act on that. To me, it's highly, highly embarrassing. So these things should not really be happening. Let me give you this last example. My organization, the International Press Center, is 25 years old. We've been there since 1999. And I can tell you that we've hosted so many, because part of the facilities in that organization is a conference hall where private individuals, groups, organizations can come, address the press, hold seminars, and hold workshops. And we have hosted so many under all governments. But now, when some groups say they want to hold a press conference, suddenly the environment is laid under siege. Yesterday, a group came to address a press conference to demand for the release of their members, and the Civil Defense Corps virtually took over, the estate where the office is located. So how are we going to interpret all this? So I feel that it is in the enlightened self-interest, if we can still talk about that, of this government to sit back and ask itself, is this what should be happening? Because very soon, there will be ratings across the world, West Africa, globally, where people will be talking about press freedom index, the civic space. And when these ratings come, and we begin to talk about them, people will say, oh, you are portraying us in negative light. But is it not the reality on the ground? So
when we come back, we're going to go for a quick break. When we come back, you may help me or help all of us find out exactly why does it look like the government or the establishment is hostile to freedom of the press. Because I know that a couple of people have been arrested, Bristol Peter, for various reasons, whether he's committed a crime or not committed a crime. We'll get to know that later. Daniel Ojukwu, remember that incident?
Of course.
The recent Adejuwon Oshoyinka, Shegun Olatunji.
So many journalists.
And then there was one embarrassing one. We had to interview, I think it's Leadership or Daily Trust. Permit me, I've forgotten. But we interviewed him one morning, and this was the CP of the FCT himself being involved in that. You were in that conversation.
I was in that conversation, really. The chairman of the Correspondence Chapel of NUJ, Nigerian Union of Journalists in Abuja, who also works for Daily Independent, who said he was physically
assaulted. And then he said the police was saying they were taking him to a safe place. He said the CP himself was literally part of the people that harassed him and all of that. So it looks like your word against mine situation. But we're going to look at why the environment looks the way it is and what we can do going forward. We'll take this quick break. When we come back, I still have Mr. Lanre with us. Join us again. The Executive Director of the International Press Center, Mr. Lanre Arogundade, joins us. He's with me still in the studio. Mr. Arogundade, thank you so much for staying with us. So I was going to the part, because when it comes to journalism, there are rights and there are responsibilities.
Definitely.
And if anybody has committed any seditious crime, you already know what it is. Yes. But even the criminal code has defined defamation. Section 373 talks about defamation. 375 talks about punishment. 376 talks about extortion. 377, interestingly, says if the defamation is said to be true and is of public interest, it can't be considered defamation. So we can go through all the laws and talk about all of that. So my question will be, why do you think the system looks hostile to dissenting voices or the press, if you will, if that is even true in the first place? So that argument should come from you. That's why we brought you, because you oversee some of these things. And the second part is, what intervention is the media doing for itself to make sure that, look, you can't gag us. No matter how hard you try, it's our responsibility.
Well, so as to why this is happening, I think this is, perhaps we need to also ask people in government, why do we have this hostile situation?
Or semi-hostile.
Or seemingly, hostile situation, the way you described it. But I guess, press freedom itself, it's linked to the right of the people, for the citizens, to know. It's linked to so many things, freedom of association, freedom of movement. In other words, the civic space must be there for there to be press freedom. And if there is an attack on the civic space, it robs us on the press. So if you looked at the end-band governance protest, for example, apparently the mindset from the point of view of the security agencies was that, we do not want this thing reported. They didn't want the protest in the first instance, and if it would take place, they feel that they should, curtail, the media. So, and we saw a situation where journalists were being told, you can't interview people, you can't do all these kind of things. I think that is one reason. And I feel that there's also a mindset that feels that the media is against us. And to that extent, we have, to do something about, the media. That does not help. I've looked at it and I've thought that if you look at some of our security agencies, we use this word that they haven't been demilitarized, because they still operate as if we're in a military, environment where the sight of a journalist, the sight of a camera instantly provokes
but just
anger.
Without trying to cut you, we can excuse that for the army. What about the police?
That's what I'm saying. That is absolutely not excusable under, a civilian, government, because civil rule comes with its own expectations. And as I was coming in, I was saying maybe what we should have had was not expectation, but assumption, because it has now become an assumption that when you have civil rule, you will have all these rights, guaranteed. We have not, seen that. So I feel that that is one, major reason, why we have all this. And we have this hostility coming from different angles, even from private individuals. It's like there's a capture of, the security agencies. They are responding to so many, forces, but we are worst off, for it. And it should not be, like that. Where we also have this hostile situation because of the way they also use some of the existing laws to target journalists. One of that is the Cyber Crimes Act. So many. And I'm sure by the time we go through our records, our documentations, you will be shocked at how many journalists have been picked on that. And it's the same pattern. You publish something, maybe online. It could be online edition of a newspaper. It could be an outrightly online publication. Then the next thing somebody complains, then the police comes in and say, oh, you are engaged in cyberbullying and so on and so forth. And then the journalist is in detention before you know it. So this is what we have. It's a massive, massive kind of assault.
I don't want to lose track. Because one of the things I want you to help us achieve is the media doing enough, media itself, all of us. Are we doing enough to protect our rights, to hold the powerful to account? Because it's naturally, human beings, we're naturally selfish.
I know. Now, so
we don't want to be held accountable.
I would say that if we look at the kind of assault we're looking at, there are areas we can say we're not doing enough, that we need to do better. We need to, at the level of the media professional bodies and associations, like the Nigeria Union of Journalists and so on, they really need to do more and say that, look, at least let's have a conversation. One of the things we've talked about before this assault became so rapid was the fact that because government also says they have their own arguments against the media, which is sometimes, we have all kind of things being published, some information that are not accurate and so on. We then said, okay, let's have a national mechanism on safety of journalists and press freedom that brings together state and non-state actors, where we can, debate, discuss these issues, and then come up with, a draft document that talks about responsibilities. Because at the end of the day, we also need to remind government that they cannot operate as if they are not part of international laws, international conventions, some of which Nigeria is a signatory, like the African Charter on Peoples and Human Rights, the United Nations. Very soon there will be UNGA, UNGA. Our government, our officials will be at New York to talk about the situation in the country. And we all know that the United Nations has 3 Ps when it comes to journalists. We call it 3 Ps: protection, prevention, and prosecution. So what we're also saying is that even where you have attacks on journalists, it is their responsibility to prosecute. But when they themselves are responsible, obviously they will not prosecute themselves. So we are in that kind of, dilemma.
Is there a way to make... Sorry, sir.
Back to your question. At the level of media support groups, in fact, civil society organizations, a lot is being done. Doing documentations, issuing statements, calling for investigations, and so on and so forth. But I feel that we as journalists as a whole, we now need to do more. In those days, if any journalist was in detention under the military, one of the things that is usually done is for them to say day 1 of this person in detention, day 2, day 3, day 4. Okay. Because we have to accept that an injury to one is an injury to all.
Because of time.
Yes.
So for balance, let's also talk about responsible journalism.
Great. Now, so that in itself is very, very important. And if there's anything you cannot accuse us of, is the fact that we've been quiet when it comes to the issue of professionalism. In fact, we've gone to the extent, when it comes to elections, for example, of developing a Nigerian media code of election coverage that stipulates some do's and don'ts. We've done a lot on ethical journalism, professional journalism, and we keep emphasizing that because we have that social responsibility. We do not like a situation where the story you publish would give anybody any excuse to say, oh, it's because, you have published, false news. So we have a social responsibility. We also have a responsibility to be very, very conflict sensitive, particularly in moments of crisis. We need to be, and we say this all the time, if there is a clash somewhere, it will be wrong for any media to just go out there and say, 50, Igalas and so on had been killed and so on. Even when it comes to casualty figures, we always say, look, let's be careful because sometimes the way you report crisis, the way you report violence can further inflame passions. So that is happening and we invest a lot on that. And I guess that by the time we're able to have conversations with those in authority, they will see that we're not just being unnecessarily antagonistic, but trying to say that, yes, but the point we're also making is that there's no profession anywhere in the world where you do not have instances where people... But the good thing is that even the same media has put together a Nigerian Mass Media Complaints Commission, which means we recognize the fact that there could be ethical infractions.
There should be some persons.
I remember the other time when the DSS also had problems, even with this same Segun Olatunji, one of the positions put forward was that, okay, bring your complaints to this commission so that I can look at it. So we're not helpless.
All right.
We have media regulatory bodies, self-regulatory bodies, even institutional ones, by government.
All right. So just land on your thought, 10 seconds.
Yeah, so that is it. And I want to come back to the point I was making earlier on, that one of the things people have asked us is that, look, these people, you have so many of your actual colleagues or friends in government. What is happening? So I feel that perhaps the problem is institutional. Okay. It's not necessarily about these individuals. And we have to tackle it at that level. And we're using this occasion to say that whatever, you might have your own, grievances, but recognize that without press freedom, there's no democracy. If we continue these violations, it will rub off negatively on the government. So let's come together and have this dialogue that will lead to a national mechanism on the safety of journalists and press freedom in Nigeria. Good place
to land on your thoughts. Executive Director, International Press Center, PRO, Association of Communication Scholars and Professionals, Lanre Arogundade. Thank you, sir, for coming on the program.
Thank you very much for your time.
Absolutely.